Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Welcome back to the Deer University podcast. I'm Bronson Strickland. I'm joined by co-director of the MSU Deer Lab, Dr. Steve Damaris. Steve, how you doing today, buddy?
Oh man, it's a wonderful day. Big day at the university for anybody that cares. We have graduation today. We're putting out more highly trained wildlife biologists.
Well, big day for the university, a bigger day for the graduates.
Absolutely.
Yeah, either 4 years as an undergraduate or 2 to 3 years as a graduate student or 4 or 5 or 6 years as a PhD student. Now they're going to get a chance to get out there and spread their wings and make Mississippi State proud.
Yes, and you know, it's a really big day for another reason. It's important to you and me personally, and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that's gone into a major research effort. And why don't you tell our folks about understanding buck movement? That's a cool looking screenshot you got there.
Yeah, so for those that are watching this on YouTube, this will be apparent. This will be very, very obvious for those that are listening just to the audio. What we have here is we're able to share a screen. So with our podcast recording software, it's very much like Zoom, how in Zoom you can share a screen. But we have on the screen the cover of our latest extension publication called Understanding Buck Movement, How, When, and Why Bucks Navigate the Landscape. And it represents many years, lots of blood, sweat, and tears, especially by graduate students that were doing the heavy lifting for this. And Steve, I want to say one thing. We were running behind on getting this extension publication out there. And I like to take blame. You know, when I'm at fault, I accept the fault and admit it. So I just want to make sure that everybody knows you are fully to blame for, for this taking so long.
Yes, this extension publication.
Yeah. I appreciate you stepping up and shouldering the responsibility for that. So thank you for being a grown man about it.
Yes, it's been a monumental effort, and you touched on the graduate students. I mean, Ashley and Colby, wow, you know, their efforts in the field, working with landowners, catching deer, data analysis, and then we've had follow-up efforts. Luke Resop, most recently, is our graduate student helping with analytics, and you know, it's just. And all the landowners, we worked about 60,000 acres of continuous land ownership and had over 30 properties in there. And, you know, so a lot of people, state agency folks, you know, and the funding for this project was a federal aid project from the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. And I guess we're going to talk a lot of different aspects of deer behavior going through this presentation, but really, you know, the kind of the big pictures that they came to us with a need some years ago was they always get blamed when hunters don't see deer, and it's always because of something they did or they didn't do. And you know, the average typical biologist response, based on what we understand about the biology of deer, it was too warm, and so hunters didn't see the deer, or it was a really great acorn crop, and so the deer weren't coming out into food plots because they're eating acorns, and in our study area we have quite a high prevalence of oaks, so that is an issue. And so they were kind of getting beat up every year because somebody's always got an opinion when it comes to deer management, and they said, hey, we need some answers so that we can explain to hunters what's really happening. We need to know what the deer are doing. We're hearing what the hunters are seeing or not seeing. We need to know what the deer are doing and maybe what the deer are seeing. And so that was the impetus for the project. And they committed a large amount of money and a lot of effort on their part to assist us. And so great thanks to the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks and our federal aid dollars that went to this.
Yeah, absolutely. As always, thanks to MDWF&P, we couldn't do this without them. So not only financially, but I would even say emotional support sometimes, all of their help. We had to have their help to make it happen. So many thanks to them. And I guess just summarizing, Steve, these projects always take longer because the logistics of pulling something like this off is enormous. So yes. A lot of moving parts, a lot of people, a lot of deer. But all that to say, we're done now. We're unveiling this. And what we're going to do today, Steve, is now that this publication is publicly available, and I've provided a link here so people can go and download, free of charge, download this publication, print it off, view it on their screen, whatever. And we just wanted to use this podcast and another one to kind of walk through these different figures. Of course, people can read everything that we wrote about it, but we wanted to give the opportunity for people that are just going to listen to a podcast or watch a video for us to go through the most important parts of the publication and talk about the data, talk about the figures and the implications for management and hunting. So let's start with biology, and let's start with thinking like a deer.
So one of the problems hunters have is sometimes they don't think like a deer. And so, back to the agency getting grief from hunters every year because they didn't see deer. Well, we want the hunter to understand how a deer is thinking, what's motivating them. And that's this figure represents that. What is a deer? What are his motivations?
Yeah, very good point. And this is something you and I both talk about all the time when we're giving seminars or presentations is let's start with what a deer is going to do day to day. What's a deer's job? And think of it this way, and this falls under in biology, we have this theory that I think is pretty accurate. Like anything in biology, there's always exceptions and individual behavior that's different, but essentially it's optimal foraging theory. And that is what deer are doing. And so they're trying to figure out where they go and how they go about it to how can I maximize calories and nutrients that my body needs, and how can I do that safely? And so what that really means is, where on the landscape do I need to go to find the highest quality food that my body needs, and how can I do it by minimizing predation risk? And in our neck of the woods, predation risk is mostly hunter risk. So where can I go to get food and avoid hunters or other predators in doing so? That's really the name of the game for a deer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we know that the more anything moves, the riskier it is for them. So in their optimization of that forage searching is, they'd rather not move a large distance to find food. They'd rather find it close by.
Right. Exactly right. And that's even part of the equation. It's not only riskier in terms of predation risk, but the further they have to go for food, they're using calories.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know a very silly example I do in seminars, Steve, is I'll take someone on the front row who's willing to play along and ask them what their favorite food is. And so it might be, for me, it's, T-bone steak or a ribeye or something like that, but whatever your favorite food is. And I'll ask them, I'll say, if right over here to your left or to your right, 5 yards away was a ribeye, let's say that's their favorite. Are you willing to walk 5 steps to eat that ribeye? Well, of course, 100%, they're going to do that. Say, would you walk 100 yards? Would you walk 100 yards if close by there was another food that wasn't your favorite, but is something you could eat? So it might be a salad. It might be a ham sandwich. It might, whatever. And you eventually will reach a point with every person where they'll say, I would really like to have that ribeye, my favorite food. I'm not going to walk 2 miles to get it when I can just step right over here and have a ham sandwich. So that is part of this equation. The theory that we're talking about is how far do they have to go? They want to minimize predation risk. They want to minimize calorie or caloric expenditure as well. So that's what all is going on in there, even though they're not thinking about it. That's kind of their genetic programming, so to speak, of how they navigate the landscape.
Yeah, and that's a great general representation of what deer are thinking. And then what we all know about is, how the rut changes behavior. And so when it becomes the potential and near breeding season, bucks start thinking a little differently. They're not just thinking like a deer, they're thinking like a buck. And a buck has different motivations during the breeding season than just optimum foraging theory and risk aversion.
Yeah. So now we add a different component. Now we move into, in terms of the hierarchy of their wants and needs, now we have something that just went to the very, very top, and that is their desire to reproduce. So now they are shifting in, they want to go to areas where they can maximize opportunity to find an estrus doe. They're still going to minimize predation risk when they can, but they just have a new priority. And everybody that's hunted long enough, you have seen a case like this where you cannot fathom that what you are doing or what you're seeing, why is that not influencing the buck? Why isn't the buck walking away? Why is what I'm doing not scaring the buck? And that is all just a completely change in their mindset and their desire to breed that completely dictates their behavior at that time.
Yep. So instead of maximizing food intake and minimizing risk, they're maximizing breeding potential and eating enough to live and trying to minimize predation risk. But like you say, when a buck's on a hot doe, he's not worrying about what's risk, who's around the neighborhood.
There is really no deterring him, when he has found an estrus doe. And this also falls into, Steve, when we look at, pretty sure we've talked about it before, but when you look at body weight change over the course of the hunting season, that is a very obvious and tangible example of when a buck is losing. Younger bucks are going to lose about 10% of their body weight in Mississippi. 4.5 and older, 5.5, they're going to lose 20, 22, 23% of their body weight. And that's exactly what's going on here. Their priority has changed. Breeding is number one. They, of course, will get a snack every now and again. They eat, but not near to the extent that they would prior to the rut and during the post-rut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we might get away with saying that, some people eat to live, some people live to eat. Before the rut, they're living to eat safely, and then during the rut, they're eating to live, just enough to get by.
Right.
So one of the cool things about this effort, Bronson, is the extent of the area that we worked in and the number of samples that we've had. A lot of people have said, well, why are you still doing deer research? There's been so much deer research, but a lot of the work in the past, particularly on buck movements, has been a really small sample size. And, they have like 4 or 5 deer collared, and somebody follows them around and writes a master's thesis. And, you learn a little bit. And what we've learned from a bunch of those little studies is there's a huge amount of variation in how deer behave. And what we've been able to do, we have a total of 55 bucks that were collared and GPS collared. And so we have really fine scale movement data on them. And every 15 minutes, the receivers, the collars were estimating the buck's location during the hunting season. So we had a lot of really high quality data. And so within this data set, we've seeing a huge amount of variation also, just like all those little projects over decades in different places and different circumstances. We see that same variation, but we have enough sample size that we can kind of categorize and kind of say, okay, there's this variation, and here's why, because this group of deer is acting this way. So it's variation, but it's categorized variation, if you would. So we've been able to package a lot of new knowledge to supplement some of our old knowledge that was only partly informed. And I mentioned earlier about the large scale studies, 55, 60,000 acres. And the screen that's showing right now gives a clip of kind of the center of the study area. And you see some major features that are important. And one of them is that squiggly line that running, left to right, right to left on the map, the aerial photo, and that's the Big Black River. And the Big Black River is a fairly major river as rivers go, but it's not like a Mississippi river. You could throw a rock across the Big Black. At least I could. I don't want to speak for your abilities, Bronson, but I could throw a rock across.
If you could, I think I could as well.
You started leaning in. You were gonna hit me with that, weren't you?
Well, I was gonna make a smart remark about depends on if it's in flood stage or not. If it's in flood stage, yeah,
that's
I don't
right.
think either one of us are.
That's right. That's right. And along that river is some really dense green vegetation, and this is predominantly bottomland hardwood forest along the river. And then outside of the river, outside of that normal flood stage area, is a lot of open fields, because floodplains are highly fertile land, and so they're great for growing crops. And so historically, farmers cut as far as they could up to a river to have fields to plant crops. And farming isn't the predominant land use now, but it's an important land use. And so we still see agricultural fields, and a lot of those smaller fields have been turned into food plots. A lot of food plots have been created. So we have quite a wide range of habitat types. And later on, when we're talking about habitat selection, we'll refer to these habitat types. One of them is the bottomland hardwood forest that is predominant along the river. And then we have some upland hardwood forests. We have some managed pine plantations, and we have summer and winter food plots. And we also just have some fields, some old growth fields that may or may not be burned or mowed, but they're not wooded. So we call those herbaceous areas. We'll be talking about these habitat land covers in more detail later on.
Yeah, and for those listening and can't see, there's a lot of agriculture in the region, but it would not be categorized as an agricultural region. So for those in the South, it's not equivalent to our Delta region, which I often joke is, if you think of our Delta region, think of your picture of Iowa, and that is our Delta region. It is, I don't know the exact percentage, 80+%, in some places 90+%, but it is agricultural fields. Mm-hmm. To me, Steve, this area is kind of that ideal mix. There's a lot of agriculture, depending on where you're on Google Earth looking on the map, it can be 50% agriculture. It could be 30% agriculture, but it's kind of that ideal mix of structural forest cover, but there's also a lot of agricultural fields and a lot of food. Mm-hmm. As a result, the deer population, like you can go to some places in the Midwest where there is essentially very little forest cover, the deer population numbers are low because of that. It's just wide open space. This is not that case. There's lots of forest cover, and there's also a lot of food. What's the result of that? We got a lot of cover, we got a lot of food. Two things happen. Deer population numbers, we got a lot of deer. We also have a lot of food. They grow some really, really, really good bucks in this region. So it is a high quality antler area.
Yeah, and adding to the value of that landscape effect is landowners, because it's a good place for deer. There's a lot of what we might call primarily recreational ownerships, where people buy land. They do a little farming, but they're really buying that land for hunting, recreational hunting. And there's also huge turkey populations there. It's just a really great place for deer and all wildlife, many wildlife species. And because it has this variation, you can never say always take these results and apply it wherever you are. But because we have forests, we have ag fields, we have food plots, we have good age structure, it's applicable to a lot of places. Although we always want to qualify that, what we report here won't necessarily exactly represent what your deer will do. However, I think when we go back to that thinking like a deer and thinking like a buck during the breeding season, those are inherent behavioral drives in the parts of bucks. And so, what our bucks are doing in this study area probably is not a lot different than what they'd be doing elsewhere in terms of motivation. Exactly when and how they do it is going to be a function of local conditions. Well, there's another qualifier, though. Before we start talking about specific results, we want to talk about the metrics that we use to measure deer movements. And there's two ways to look at this. One is just kind of the total movement of a deer throughout any time period, say a daily movement of a buck. And this representation, this figure shows 4 times, T1, T2, T3, and T4 being observations of a location of a buck. And we can measure the distance, the straight line distance between 2 subsequent locations, and tally that up for the day, and that's the total amount of distance that buck made or moved during the day. And we also like to look at net displacement. Kind of where were they at the beginning of the 24-hour period and where were they at the end of the 24-hour period? And that net displacement is different than total movement.
So there is the data showing total distance and net displacement, or net distance in this case. What we're measuring there, the y-axis is yards traveled per day. The alternative y-axis is miles traveled per day. Those that are watching can see this, but I'll just give a brief description for those just with the audio. We have along the x-axis 2 months and then phases of the rut. So we have October, November, then pre-rut, early rut, peak rut, late rut, post-rut. Steve, why don't you talk about that real quick? Because we broke out, quote, phases of the rut that are a lot different. Why don't you explain that?
What we looked at was, we know from past research that there are different patterns of behavior as a function of when the rut is happening. Most people that read and listen to podcasts know that scraping activity, for example, peaks prior to the peak of the actual breeding activity, because the scraping is a signpost behavior where bucks are advertising and looking for other deer. And so when they're doing that, it's because they're not actually breeding does. They're not going to scrape the ground and paw the ground and chew on a branch if there's an estrus doe nearby. They're going to be going for the real thing as opposed to, hey, I'm in the neighborhood. So these different behavioral changes we wanted to try to capture in our analysis. So we broke the rut basically into 2-week intervals. Pre-rut meaning, well, let's start at the peak rut and work out. The peak rut is the 2-week period during which the majority of the breeding takes place. And this is somewhere around 70% of the breeding is during those 2 weeks. And then 2 weeks before that is early rut. 2 weeks after that is late rut. So early, peak, and late cover about a 6-week interval. And the reason we didn't use the actual months of the year and dates is because this needs to be useful to other areas. And the fact that peak rut was late December, early January in our study area, that's just unique to us, and it's going to be different in other regions of the country. So we want to just talk about the phase of the rut and not the date. But October and November are just there because, well, they're October and November.
Well, it kind of serves as baseline as well before all the rutting behavior.
Yeah.
And just to clarify again, so for October and November, obviously, those are month-long time intervals. And then our rut intervals, you see there are 2-week intervals. So we're moving from when we start out in October and November are remarkably similar. But total distance moved for a 24-hour period is about 4,000 yards. So moving about 4,000 yards per day. Interestingly, the net distance, and remember that's the distance between time 1 and the last time interval for the day, is around 450 yards in October. 450, 460, something like that. 470, 480 in November. And I'm kind of making a point about this, Steve, is because later, whether it's in this episode or the next, when we start talking about the affinity to a bedding site, this net distance, if you think about it, if you're looking at what we're talking about, listening, and start thinking about this net distance, if a buck came back to the same bed or even the same small bedding area day after day after day, the net distance would be essentially zero.
That's right.
But we're seeing that there is on average, remember, this is across days and across 50 to 60 different bucks, the average in October is around 460 yards. And then as we move into the rut, Steve, we're going to move into the pre-rut. It's a little over for net distance, net displacement, a little over 500. The early rut, about 550 yards. The peak rut, we're about 600 yards. And this was interesting to me. The late rut, so the 2 weeks after the peak, is where we see the greatest net displacement difference, and that's about 700 yards. So, Steve, the way I interpret that is most of the females have been found, they have been bred, but there's still that 10% or maybe 20% that are still coming into estrus. And so the searching behavior, they are scouring the landscape looking for those few remaining does. So during the peak rut, again, net displacement is about 600. And that is where during the peak rut, we have the greatest total daily distance. So the total distance a buck is moving is about 7,500 yards in a day. The net displacement is about 600. If you want to translate that to miles traveled, so during the peak of the rut, that is over 4 miles a day that buck is covering.
Yeah. And let's point out that that's not necessarily 4 linear miles. It's just his total movement. He can be moving in circles.
Yep.
And collecting distance, like walking around a track for exercise or your neighborhood. So
it's a minimum estimate. There's more movement in between those locations we can't capture.
That's true too. Absolutely. So I think the big take home for me from this representation of the data is, they move a lot. They move even more during the breeding season, but that the idea of the old bed site where they keep coming back and that variation we talked about. Yeah, there are some bucks that probably come back to a lot of the same beds, but on average, they don't.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to split a little hair here too. We don't know that the beginning and the ending data point for each day is a bed site. We're talking like it is, but we don't absolutely, we didn't verify that they were in a bed at the beginning of each of these 24-hour periods. They were just 24-hour periods.
Yeah, good point. And more of that to come. We're literally working on that now. So we'll be able to specify on a daily basis, quantify the distance between the bed sites. Very good point. One last little thing I want to mention here, Steve, too. It's not directly related to this graph or these results, but in general, when you and I are asked questions about, let's relate it to, say, weather or barometer or moon or whatever. But the fundamental is there is some environmental variation, and is that affecting deer? And from a hunter's perspective, they don't have a GPS collar on bucks.
Yeah.
It's just, am I seeing deer above average numbers today or not? We can't measure that with this type of study. All we can measure is how the distance that a buck traveled and, when is it moving and so forth. So just keep that in mind, that we're never with these type of data going to be able to reconcile that hunters saw deer today and not the next. What we're showing you here is when you put a marker on a deer where you can track them, every single day they move. They may not move in the spot where you saw it, but every day they have to move because they're either wanting to fill their rumen with food or they're looking for a partner. They're looking for a doe. Deer move every day. Okay, Steve, here is total distance traveled, and we just have month. We've got total distance traveled in yards on the y-axis, the up and down axis, and along the x-axis is month. And we start this one with our baseline in September, and in Mississippi in September, it's hot. It's still really, really hot. And that is where we see the least amount of daily distance moved.
And we see this big jump in December and January, and that's basically our rutting period. So those 5 rut periods that we talked about in the last slide are represented by December and January. And so we can transition quickly from this to, I think our next figure shows the actual rut phases that probably is most applicable to people's interest. And they were seeing that pre-rut 5,000 up to 7,500 in the peak rut and back down to 5,000 in the post-rut. So that movement rate is just really simply represented here. This is that total distance, not the net distance. Telling the same story that we showed a minute ago, just in a different, simpler way.
And I guess one thing to emphasize, absolutely, of course, a buck is on his feet the most during the peak of the rut, but they're still moving a lot in the pre-rut and the post-rut. So 5,000 yards per day versus 7,500. That's still a lot of opportunity to see a buck on his feet.
There might be some hunters listening that might say, well, I don't believe it. If a buck is moving 7,500 yards over 4 miles a day, why don't I see him? And let's just throw in a little teaser. Listen to the next podcast.
Yeah. This
is a busy one.
Yeah, this is going to be tough to describe. This is definitely a more of a visual type data. This is really just showing, I think, take home here is, of course, there's differences when you go from the non-rut to the rut, but this is average distance moved per hour. So think in all the previous graphs on the x-axis or the categories we're looking at, it's either month or rut phase, but these big blocks of time. Here we're looking at it hour by hour, so a 24-hour scale. And essentially, it just confirms what we've always said and what most people know. Deer are crepuscular. They're not diurnal. They're not nocturnal. They're crepuscular. And that essentially just means movement peaks at sunup and sundown. And these data just show that. And then we just show that movement increases as you go through the phases of the rut. So hourly distance moved or average distance moved by hour is least before the rut, and it just increases as we go to the pre-rut, the peak of the rut, and then the post-rut. But the same pattern exists. They move more at sunup, they move more at sundown than during the middle of the day or even during the middle of the night.
Yeah, so it's a complex looking graph, but it's just look for the general pattern.
Yeah, look for the spikes.
Yep, and that tells the story. This is a home run figure right here. And if you're just listening to this and not seeing it, download the publication and spend some time looking at this thing, because it's hard to, we can't represent talking what this figure shows. But again, if you just look for the general storyline, this is that hourly distance traveled by rut phase, but separated by day and night. And so when there's no rut, the movement during the day is always going to be less and roughly half the distance per hour as it is during the nighttime, because deer are more active, that crepuscular, and through the night, they're going to be more active. So the hourly rate is twice as much at night as it is in the daytime, until you get into that beginning of the rut and through the peak rut and post rut. I mean, that's when you see the bucks. You have the better chance of seeing the bucks because their daytime movement rate almost matches their nighttime.
Yeah. And to give people listening the actual numbers that we're talking about, outside of the rut or before the rut, bucks are moving about 100 yards per hour. Same time of year at night, they're moving about 200 yards per hour. That's kind of their speed, their velocity. That more or less doubles then when we get to the peak of the rut. And night and day are equivalent. So during the peak of the rut, during the day and night, they're moving about 300 yards per hour.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, personality.
These dadgum mobile bucks.
And this relates so much to that the agency's initial questions about why are hunters not seeing deer, and everybody has those examples like, well, I had this buck on camera following him all summer and into the fall, and it came hunting season, he was gone. Or I didn't see this buck until he just showed up. I had cameras operating for 3 months and he was never there, and then he was there. And what's going on? So because we had this large source of variation, but enough sample size to categorize these behaviors, we were able to break out 2 different personality types. And one of them is the mobile buck. And about a third of our bucks fit this general category of basically living in 2 places, sometimes more than 2, but generally 2 home ranges, 2 separate home ranges.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, Steve, when you think about when you started your career 100 years ago.
It was closer to 80, but
okay.
We won't split hairs.
You and I both doing similar work several decades ago, let's say that. We were using VHF collars. And so that's kind of the equivalent of a walkie-talkie, meaning you had to get close enough to the deer with the antenna in your hand and you listen for the beep. And I know when I was in South Texas doing that, there were just some bucks that you would conclude that the collar failed, the battery died, because you were not getting a signal anymore. And what we're seeing now with these GPS collars is they just moved away. And on the figure we have here, that's showing two very distinct home ranges. So it's not that the buck is just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It is literally spending part of its year in a distinct area. And in this case, it is moving 2 miles away and spending part of the year there as well. So what I explain to people is, think of, instead of the home range looking like a big circular blob, like we always thought of, it looks more like a dumbbell. You got a blob to the left and a blob to the right and a little trail back and forth linking them together. So that's a good example of a mobile buck home range is.
And when we, this example is a couple of miles away, the average was about 4.5 miles separating the two home ranges. So, most people don't hunt on a property that is large enough to encompass both home ranges. That's why deer come and go off of your property. The average is 4.5 miles. We've had some really outliers back to that variation. There's so much variation, but within this category, we had some extreme cases. We thought we had like the best, most extreme case. He moved over 10 miles. And there's an interesting little story behind him. We caught him on a particular night in August, and the next day he disappeared from the study area. We thought, oh goodness, we pissed him off. He left. We wonder if we'll ever come back. Well, we because of the GPS collars, they were telling us where he was, and we learned that he was over 10 miles away on another property. And we thought, well, we lost him. Maybe we'll get some movement data over there. And the next February, he came back. And we thought, oh, that's great. He got over us. He came back. But then the next August, literally within a few days when he left the previous year, he left again and went to the same dang place and stayed there and came back in February. So these movements, they're extremely variable. And if all you're doing is hunting a 100-acre property and you see a buck and then you don't know what the heck's happened. Has he been killed? Has he, been killed by a hunter, run over by a car, died natural mortality? What's going on? Well, this tells us that a lot of those bucks, they're just living somewhere else. Yeah. They're living another life.
They're living a double life, Steve.
Yeah. Yeah. And talk about the average home range size. And so basically, if you're watching this, you can see the two kind of red outline shapes there. The area within those two red lines is the home range estimate for that particular buck. And the average home range size for the 1/3 of the adult bucks that were mobile was over 12,000 acres. So the idea that, we can talk about managing small properties to facilitate presence of deer during the hunting season. And we can, there's definitely ways you can help yourself with that. But the biology of the deers, they're living at a larger scale than 100 acres or even 200 or 300 acres. They're living maybe miles and miles away.
So, Steve, to explain this phenomenon a little bit differently in terms of the story of that particular buck you were talking about, just to kind of allude to some other data we're going to show, when you first caught that buck and thought it skedaddled the next day, you're probably thinking, we caught that buck during an excursion. So it just left his normal home range for the weekend trip, and we were lucky enough to catch him, and then he moved back to his primary home range.
Yeah.
But what you did was you caught a mobile buck that has the affinity for two different home ranges versus just an excursion. So much variation we're learning too on all these different classifications, and the length of time that they spend in each one is just amazing with the GPS collars, what all we've learned. Here's another thing I get asked, Steve, and I'm genuinely asking you this question. I'll give you my opinion. when we show this, some people will say, what can we do about it? They might interpret it as, that's fair. There is something deficient on my property I'm hunting or managing or leasing. What can we add more food? Is it because it's a lack of doe? On and on. My interpretation is there's nothing you can do about this. This is innate or inherent in some particular bucks, and they're just going to move.
Yep. And we're, I'm personally familiar with the property that this particular buck that we're talking about moved to. And it was a well-managed property, similar harvest approach, letting bucks get older, managing timber for forage production, lots of good quality food plots, summer and winter. I mean, they're essentially identical habitat quality. Right. So that doesn't explain it. Hunting pressure was similar. He just wanted to live in two places. So we thought we had this superstar mobile buck with that one that moved 10 miles, but then we moved to a new study area along the Mississippi River, caught some more bucks, and we had 140 who became a superstar nationally, maybe even internationally. After we collared him, he spent the normal amount of time during the hunting season. And then after the hunting season, about March, late February, he started moving. We could see him moving on a daily basis. He got over to the edge of the Mississippi River, spent about a week there, right on the edge of the river, and then swam the river. This river is, even you couldn't throw a rock across the Mississippi River at this stage. It's over a mile across at this point. It's it's the second largest river in the world. So it was a big deal for him to swim. So he swam across and spent the spring and summer over in Louisiana. We identified where he was. We talked to a local conservation officer, got the guy's name. We communicated with the owner of the property. I think he even said he saw the collared buck on his property eating soybeans. And we thought, well, he's gone from our study. Well, not so much. The next, August, he swam back and spent the fall and winter in Mississippi. And we thought, oh, that's interesting. Wonder if he's going to do it again. And the next spring, he swam the river again, spent the summer in Louisiana, came back. Now, we can't, I try not to editorialize here. He spent Mississippi, hunting season in Mississippi. Does he know something about the ability of Mississippi hunters versus those in Louisiana?
I have no idea. That's a reasonable hypothesis.
Trying to stay away from those Louisiana hunters. But so we had this really great story, and after his battery died, one of the hunter here in Mississippi was able to harvest him, and I think there was a National Deer magazine article written about his experience harvesting this really unique buck. So great story, super example of an ultra mobile buck.
Yeah. I was just going to reiterate what's really interesting about him is he did it twice. So it wasn't just this 1 year, a one-off that we can't explain. I mean, it appeared to be a pattern of behavior because we documented that back and forth 2 years in a row. So
now, I would love to know, was he born in Louisiana or was he born in Mississippi?
Yeah.
How did he learn to swim the river? Did his mother train him as a fawn to swim the river? Or did he just, disperse as a yearling buck from one state or the other and then decided to swim back? Or, we'll never know.
Yeah.
But I wonder about those things. But anyway, we can't wonder too much. We have lots of data still to talk about.
Yeah. And the bottom line, I guess, Steve, is just recognizing that about, at least with our data, we can't say this is occurring in Minnesota or New York or Florida, but with our data, 1/3 of the bucks demonstrated this type of behavior.
That's
Buck
right.
140 was extraordinary because of the distance and swimming the river. But like the buck we see on the screen here, that's, about 2 miles or something. But about 1/3 of the bucks are demonstrating this behavior where they have two completely different home ranges.
That's right. And, the examples we've talked about so far went, came back, went and came back, in a very distinct pattern. We have some other bucks, and those bucks that we've been talking about shifted their home range from one location to another and then came back. We have some other bucks that I think Luke or you came up with a term that they were the bouncing mobile bucks because they bounced back and forth. They might go 3, 4, 5, or even 6 times a year make these movements.
Yeah. So that's a I think what we called it, it's a subcategory, a sub personality.
Yeah.
So we got kind of a sedentary versus a mobile personality. And then within the mobile personality type, we have a shifter versus a bouncer. And a shifter just means it makes a decided shift from home range 1 to home range 2. And then it stays there a good length of time, months. The bouncer was after a pinball. We just got thinking of a pinball and a pinball machine. A bouncer still has these 2 distinct home ranges, but it is just bouncing back and forth very frequently between the 2. So
yeah, and these mobile bucks, they have a huge home range, over 12,000 acres within those red lines.
Yeah.
12, that's huge. Nope. Very few properties are 12,000 acres.
That's right. And then we just contrast it. This is the typical scenario, a sedentary buck, like what we envisioned all bucks before these GPS collar studies. We kind of envisioned all bucks, at least in the South, had this type of home range. So, and this is still the norm. This is 67% of the bucks have this type of home range. And what we're showing here, though, is all of those locations over an entire year. Now, this is an example of an annual home range. And if you were to then look or delve into, if you color-coded the dots to the January points or the February points, there would be overlap, but you would see different movement, the buck utilizing different parts of its annual home range throughout the year.
That's right. That's right. It might be down near some soybean fields in September, and October he moves to another part of his annual home range.
Right, right.
So sedentary bucks aren't sitting in one place. They're still moving. They're just within the year's time, they're relatively sedentary. Another thing that, I think people looking at this figure with the red line being the boundary of the home range will think, well, okay, the home range is that, but what are all those little dots outside the home range? And this is just the kind of a standard analytical approach that we use for estimating home ranges. We never include all of the points. We include roughly, in this case, 95% of the points is a standard home range estimate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all about likelihood and being able to predict. So yeah, there are a lot of little dots outside of the red line. That just essentially means that there are occurrences where there are days where it's outside of its quote home range, but you can say with a great amount of confidence that it can be found within the red line, inside of that red boundary polygon.
And this is just an example. This is buck 13. He was a sedentary buck.
Yeah. So just another way, Steve, of looking at the data here. This is just averages now. And then we put the percentage of bucks that fall within these home range size categories. And you can kind of see 2 distinct relationships here. The first 3 columns, the categories are 0 to 500 acres, second column 500 to 1,000, third column 1,000 to 1,500. About 67% of the bucks, because they're sedentary, have this kind of normal, conventional home range, and they all fall within the 500,000 or 1,500 category. But then you have, what is that, about, well, it's going to end up having to be about 33%.
That's right.
Some simple math there. That is those mobile bucks. And then some of those, when you combine home range number 1 for part of the year and home range number 2 for part of the year, you get 2,000, 4,000, greater than 4,000 acre home ranges. So
that's right.
It just shows you the variation, the individual buck variation and home range size.
And deer biologists forever like to say, well, an average buck is going to cover 1,000 acres on an annual home range. And, biologists across the eastern United States generally say that. Mm-hmm. And the average of all of our bucks was about 900 acres. So, our deer are not abnormal. The average value is very similar to what most deer biologists say a buck occupies. Mm-hmm. But when you really have enough data to really look at the variations, you come up with these different personalities. And somebody might say, well, why would you start at 0? No buck's going to have a 0 acre home range. Well, that's just a category. But we had, I think there was one buck that had like 100 acre annual home range. I mean, he talk about a home buddy.
Yeah.
He was just hardly moving. We thought he was dead half the time because he wasn't moving, but that's just his behavioral pattern. And then we've got this deer that swim the Mississippi River. Mm-hmm. Huge variation.
It takes all kinds, Steve.
That's right.
It takes all kinds.
That's right.
Okay, Steve, this was one of my favorite outcomes of looking at the data. I think this is really interesting. And if you remember, we really wanted to think about this from kind of a different scale. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, we look at these home range estimates and we'll either do it seasonally, like it's fall and winter, or we'll do it annually, like we just talked about. We wanted to look at it from, say, a hunting perspective. And so you're on a property, you got a day, you got 3 days, you got a week, whatever. And in some states, they may only have a week-long gun season. So we just kind of wanted to make it meaningful of how much ground is a buck covering on a daily scale and then on a 2-week scale. So the categories there, we have 5 categories that goes from pre-rut to early rut to peak rut to late rut to post-rut. So pre, early, peak is right in the middle, late, and then post. And so those 2-week categories we talked about earlier. So what was remarkable to me, Steve, was that regardless of the rut phase, a buck is covering about 200 acres a day. Doesn't matter if it's in the pre-rut, doesn't matter if it's post-rut, late, whatever. They're covering about 200 acres of ground a day. And to me, that's just meaningful, thinking about going out on a property and hunting that somewhere, if the buck's on your property, that is, and he's not a mobile buck that's 5 miles down the road, but just thinking about these little 200 acre areas in a day that buck is using. Now you combine that with the daily scale to the 2-week scale. The 2-week scale, we go from during the pre-rut daily is 200 acres, and then the 2-week pre-rut is about almost, I'm going to round here, is almost 600 acres. Very same with the early rut, 600 for daily scale, 2-week scale is about 600. That, of course, then increases during the peak of the rut to over 800 acres. But the late rut, so that 2-week interval after the peak, is where we saw the largest 2-week home range, and that was 1,600 acres. So it doubled, that 2-week home range size doubled from the peak of the rut. And the way we kind of, I guess, reconcile that, Steve, just thinking that the bucks did not have to range as far during the peak of the rut. Does were available. That's the amount of time when the greatest number of does are simultaneously in estrus, is the peak of the rut, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But then that number starts dropping off. Now you've only got, 25% maybe, or 10%. But anyway, there's far, far fewer does on the landscape in estrus. Bucks are having to search. They're having to cover more ground. But remarkably, they're still only covering 200 acres a day, but over the 14 days of that interval of time, they're covering 1,600 acres. Now, one little point to think about. Let's go back to our net displacement metric we talked about earlier, that net distance. And so when you think about during the pre-rut, for example, they're covering 200 acres during the day and only 600 acres during the 2-week interval of the pre-rut. There's a lot of overlap. From day to day to day, there's a lot of overlap in the area where they're spending time. When you get to the late rut, where they're covering 1,600 acres over a 2-week period, there are great distances between. The net displacement is much further apart. So daily use area is the same, but they're moving further the next day or the next day to cover 1,600 acres.
Mm-hmm.
I just talked a lot, so I will let you. I'll let you talk some.
Oh, I want to emphasize to our listeners and viewers here that those 200 acre daily values. That's not just the sedentary bucks. That's all of the bucks. Even the bucks with averaging 12,000 acre annual home range, they're still 200 acres is the average of all of the bucks. So that just, you think, well, the sedentary bucks are going to do 200 acres, but the mobile bucks will be much greater than that. No. This is a generalizable value for all adult bucks in our study, 200 acres.
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't want to try to trek around 200 acres in a really slow walk trying to find a buck like that. But at least you have this lets hunters realize, well, regardless of whether it's a mobile or a sedentary buck, I've got a chance at a buck because he's within 200 acres today. I just have to be in the right spot in that 200 acre home range to find them and see them and make the decision to harvest them. And our next episode, we'll talk more specifically about hunting and hunting strategies and help those hunters figure out where in that 200 acre area they might want to focus their energies.
Yeah. Very good stuff there. Yeah, I really like that a lot. And just looking at the data too, Steve, and I know I'm generalizing here, bucks are different, hunters are different, but I guess the way I try to frame it in my mind is if I'm strategically patterning a buck, like I've picked out a target buck, I'm going to want to get him prior to or during the pre-rut. He's probably more established, and we can just see that with the data. How close together the daily home range and that 2-week home range is. His movements are a lot less spatially, not covering as much ground.
Mm-hmm.
But alternatively, if I'm just hunting, I'm just going to go sit somewhere and I'm going to watch and hopefully see bucks. Believe it or not, because we've kind of always said, I know I've said that before, the absolute peak of the rut is your best chance. Go sit all day. Bucks are going to be moving.
Mm-hmm.
But really, it's the next 2 weeks, right after the peak. That's when bucks are covering the most ground. Not on a daily. Daily, it's still 200 acres, but over the course of that 2-week period, it's double the amount of acreage than during the peak of the rut. That was interesting to me.
Keep hunting.
Keep hunting.
Don't
Absolutely.
give up just because the rut's over. Peak of the rut. So what else we got here, Bronson?
Let's talk about some excursions. There's probably more unknowns here than knowns. We don't necessarily. There's a lot of educated guesses what excursions are about, looking for greener pastures. They're collecting data about the landscape, better situation in the near term or long term. Who knows? But the data that we're showing here is the percentage of excursions by month. And we see most of these excursions with our data, with our bucks, and based on when our rut is, we see them from December to March. We still see a few in September. We even see some in June. We see some in August, but most of them are from December to March.
Hey, before we, just in case there's someone listening that doesn't know what an excursion is, let's clarify that an excursion is just a short-term, temporary movement out of their home range, typically for just a day or 3 or 4 days. They go somewhere and they come back.
Yeah,
kind of like I've heard you say, a weekend trip somewhere.
Yeah. So this is classified as a different movement behavior than like what we were saying with the mobile buck personality. And the distinction is with those mobile buck personalities, they are setting up a new seasonal home range somewhere else. They are showing a lot of site fidelity to a new area. All we're talking about here is they're leaving for a day or two.
Yeah.
They're taking a little trip and coming back.
The real underlying reason behind why they're doing this is always, an interesting talking point around the campfire or whatever. And, it really comes down to, in my mind, is kind of a deep inherent adaptation for a certain number of animals within every population to have knowledge about other places in case that's needed. And you have a good term for it. You've used. I like that.
Well, with in the bird world, it's called, or it's a hypothesis. It's called prospecting. And just very, very quickly here, the way I saw it used was nesting female birds. When the male comes in to swap out incubation, the female will then fly around and look for spots, we assume, for the following nesting season. So in other words, when you put a little GPS harness on these birds, they have movements that are not explained by foraging. So they leave the nest. Of course, they got to go get food. They got to eat. But then you'll see them going to other locations that they're not foraging. And the term used is they're prospecting, with the assumption that they evaluate my situation this year and if I'm going to be successful raising my clutch, and I might try somewhere else next year. Whether deer are doing this to some degree, your guess is as good as mine.
And this graph is all of our deer, regardless of mobile versus sedentary personalities. But there are some differences in those personality types relative to their, shall we say, propensity for making excursions. The average mobile buck only made 1 excursion per year. The average sedentary buck made about 6 excursions every year. So even though the sedentary bucks are sedentary, they're still going out and prospecting, and whether it's prospecting for food or for potential breeding opportunities or whatever, they're still doing it. The mobile, I think they spend so much time traveling between their home ranges that they don't need to spend time also on an excursion.
Right. That is interesting. Very interesting. So it's just the nature of a deer to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, Steve, I think we're nearing the end of part 1 here, but let's wrap it up with behavior by time of day.
Yeah.
And you want to start with this?
Well, sure. This analysis is basically the result of a software package, and I don't want to even mention the name of the analytical technique because I wouldn't spell it or use it correctly, but it looks at the distance between consecutive locations and the turning angle relative to the previous location before these two. So is it walking in a straight line or is it turning a lot? And so this algorithm figures out patterns of movement and assigns them into categories. And then we look at the characteristics of those categories and identify what we think are the behaviors associated with those statistical categories. So we came up with three. One is walking, and that's just basically more or less a straight line. And that's in the green. And then there's feeding or tending. And we group these because, we don't know whether a buck is feeding or actually moving around a doe tending her. So we can't split those out. And then there's the bedding where they're just not moving. And so we have I think we're telling a pretty interesting story. It's not an absolutely 100% accurate, but the pattern makes sense. And in this particular figure, we've got the daily pattern. And why don't you explain what the daily pattern there is?
Well, but before that, I'll just add one little thing. Someone may be saying, why don't you guys just look at the data? Why don't you just plot it on a map and you can tell, is the deer moving or is it bedded? But because when you have a million, no exaggeration, when you have a million data points, you can't do that.
That's right.
So you have to come up with the computational power of code to go through and I'm sure the code misses time and time again, but an overwhelming proportion of the time it gets it right. And it was also validation because when we look at the classification of these behaviors by the time of day, it makes absolute sense. And so, like most obviously, when is a deer bedded the most? We have 4 time periods here: sun up or dawn, day, midday, dusk or sunset, and nighttime. And so we see the greatest proportion of a buck's time bedded is during the middle of the day. No Nobel Prize there for that. And then we see the next most frequent is during the middle of the night. When are they bedded least? Well, of course, it's when they're on their feet, either feeding or walking. So we see bedding least at dawn and dusk, which is the same time we see the greatest amount of feeding and tending and walking. So if, in other words, the way these data are, you got to divide up 100%. Mm-hmm. If bedding goes up, then the other two behaviors have to go down and vice versa. And we see the greatest amount of movement. We say they're crepuscular, like we talked about earlier. They're moving more. They're up and around during dawn and at dusk. And that is exactly what we see with these data. Now let's look at it, Steve, by rut period. So again, we've got the pre-rut, early rut, peak rut, late rut, and post-rut. Where do you think you would see the greatest amount of walking? During the rut. So right during the meat of the curve, during the rut, that is when they spend a less amount of time bedded. So we see the greatest amount of walking and the least amount of bedded time is during the peak of the rut. And what is remarkably similar from the pre to the post is the amount of time feeding and tending, which is about 35%. But we see a little uptick to almost 40% during the post-rut. And we think that's just bucks and post-rut recovery looking for food.
Yeah.
There we go. That is the end of part 1.
Yes.
So we wanted to break this up. We didn't want to make a single 3-hour episode. So we wanted to kind of talk about the reasons and the fundamentals, talk about the motivations of deer and why they're moving and so forth, the metrics that we use to measure movement, and then some of the analyses that we presented here with home range size and differences and mobile versus sedentary. and then their movement behaviors during the rut and even during the day.
Mm-hmm. And, I'm really excited. I mean, this stuff is all exciting, Bronson. It's hard to say one thing is more than the other, but we just have a wonderful life, don't we? We get to tinker with deer all the time.
Yeah.
And learn about it, and then share our knowledge. But I'm really excited about expanding from this basic, movement behavior content to what does this mean to the hunter? We're going to talk about bedding sites and what a bedding site looks like, so we can help landowners build habitat on their property. We're going to talk about how deer respond to food plots, how and when. We're going to look at habitat selection of the bucks during the hunting season. What type of habitats or land covers are they living in? And we also have a really cool component here where we had all of the hunters on this study area recording when and where they were hunting. So we're going to look at the habitat selection of hunters. Not
That's
just
right.
Where were the deer, but where were the hunters?
Where do hunters select?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And we're going to talk about feeders and how they might be affecting deer movements. And we got a lot of fun things to bring out at the next podcast. So I hope our listeners will look forward to that release at a later time.
I think that was a very sufficient stay tuned. All right, Steve, we'll wrap it up. Thanks so much, and we will see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Happy hunting.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.